Once upon a time, 3,000 years ago, there were constant, ruthless confrontations for the right to life between the Demon King and an ordinary earthly warrior. In the end, after his long-awaited victory, the warrior imprisoned the Demon King, and the people on Earth were finally able to live in peace. However, having gathered his own strength, the Demon King again decided to attack the human world after such a long time in order to avenge the lost war. The Lord cast a spell, moved his hand and opened a magical portal in front of him, which would instantly transport him to the earthly world. His faithful servants watched carefully and were amazed at the greatness of the king, since he was so easily able to charm such a powerful thing. The king looked at his servants one last time, ordered them to follow him and entered the portal. A bunch of monsters obediently hummed and clapped their hands in support of their leader. But this pleasure did not last long. After the Demon King dissolved into the portal, it disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only a small purple spark. All the demons immediately panicked, not understanding what they should do now without a leader and a magical portal that was supposed to change their lives. In the human world, a huge purple portal could be seen in the middle of the sky, and a joyful Demon King instantly flew out of it, enthusiastically calling for everyone else to follow him. The guy took a confident step and after a second realized that he was not on the ground at all. The Lord flew down helplessly with thoughts that the portal had opened in a completely inappropriate place, and he had not practiced his magical skills. Suddenly, a brilliant idea came to him, and the guy decided to fly away with the help of his magical powers. The Demon King cast a magic spell and flew on contentedly, thinking that now everything would get better. But after a moment, the guy realized that all his magic was completely powerless in the human world, which made him grimace. Without finding a solution, without noticing it, the king landed on the roof of a man's house with a huge crash, successfully punching a huge hole in it. There was a huge hole in the ceiling of the room, and a poor guy was sitting on the floor, holding his head and muttering that such falls were really painful. Having come to his senses a little, the guy stood up and began to examine the room in which he landed. The Demon King looked around and noticed some noise coming from the other part of the bathroom he was in. Suddenly, there was a quiet click and the door the guy was looking at carefully opened. A girl entered the room, asking someone about the bathroom, but after she saw the stranger, she involuntarily became dumbfounded and fell silent. They stood frozen in front of each other, not knowing what to do or how to react. And the Demon King could only make a few strange sounds. The girl was the first to react, and giving the leader a tasty blow to the face, menacingly called him a pervert. The guy flew out of the house like a torpedo through the same hole through which he got there, surprised that a person actually hit him. The house was filled with a bunch of excited screams from the guards, who only called Miss Lin, asking if everything was okay. Suddenly, the alarms in the estate blared, and the Demon King lay motionless on the grass, still surprised that he was injured by a human. As soon as he found the strength to stand up, the guy immediately saw a bunch of guards pointing at him, calling him a trespasser. Within a moment, the guy was surrounded by many guards, and the alarm was still ringing from the house, because of which the poor man could not concentrate. The young man could not understand what was happening, and doubts swirled in his head that people were preparing for a battle with him. The guards attacked the intruder, assuring him that the guy had no chance of escaping. But the Demon King was not at all taken aback. The guy confidently declared that a dozen weak people would never be able to defeat him. The guy declared the battle started and enthusiastically cast a magic spell that should have made him invincible. The king stood in a strange position and began to call forth fire, which was supposed to incinerate the souls of his opponents. But for unknown reasons, nothing happened. Beads of sweat began to run down the Demon King's face in excitement as his magic wasn't working the same as when he fell. In a panic, he helplessly waved his hands, ordering the fire of the chamber, but the magic simply disappeared without a trace. Realizing that unearthly forces had failed him, the young man thought that something had happened to his strength when he came to Earth. The king grabbed his head, feeling that his magical power was very weakened, and that was why it was completely inactive. The guy looked at his own hands and thought that now he was powerless, since even an ordinary human girl was able to beat him up. The Overlord opened his eyes and came back to reality as there were still a bunch of guards standing around him. A second later, having made the decision to give a Drala, the guy took off and ran, and several dozen guards rushed after him, shouting to stop. 10 minutes later, the Demon King managed to break away and run into some dark corner, getting rid of his tail. The guy pressed himself against the cold concrete wall and, catching his breath, said to himself that he did not expect such a sharp outflow of strength because he could barely breathe after a 10-minute run. The attempt to charm the magical radiance was unsuccessful, and the Demon King sat down on the ground in disappointment. The young man sat in the middle of an empty alley and thought that the content of magic in the air was incredibly low. The king did not understand the reason for this problem, but he knew one thing for sure. After such a stormy morning, he needed a good rest. He left the alley and immediately found himself on one of the central streets of the city, on which huge skyscrapers towered, and cars rushed along the road at breakneck speed. The guy froze, not knowing what to do, because he did not expect such changes in the human world, because 3,000 years ago the earth was completely different. The king found himself in the midst of a lively street, not understanding where to go and what to do, while huge crowds of people rushed in front of him. The poor man looked around, trying to fit into such a strange rhythm of life and at least get used to it a little. The guy looked at the tall skyscrapers, which seemed to him similar to the towers of his castle in the Kingdom of Demons. Such bizarre and huge buildings made him think that people were preparing for the arrival of demons on Earth by erecting buildings for protection. Without noticing it, the guy found himself on the road, and at that very moment a car flew past him, almost hitting the poor guy. An angry driver looked out of a huge Mercedes, pointed out the red traffic light to the king, and cursed him. Before he could recover, the guy just stared at the car, surprised that this pile of metal was faster than even flying dragons. Vladika walked further down the street, and suddenly his attention was drawn to a television set behind the window of one of the shops. The young man stopped and began to examine this magical instrument, inside of which there was a woman talking about something. The young lady, in turn, was holding a children's fairy tale in her hands and telling the story of how demons and their king invaded the earth thousands of years ago. The girl said that the Demon King and his subordinates burned, killed, and robbed everything around them, and the human world was in great danger. The Demon King stood and listened to the story of himself with satisfaction, adding that the reason for this attack was the incredible weakness and frailty of the human people. But suddenly the narrator spoke about a fearless warrior who stood up to protect ordinary people in order to give a thrashing to evil spirits. She said that he bravely fought the demons, and the children, who also listened attentively to the story on the other side of the screen, opened their mouths in delight. The Demon King snorted with displeasure and said that if it weren't for that warrior, he would have been the king of the human world. The young lady continued her story, talking about numerous battles, in the end, from which the warrior emerged as a complete winner, giving peace to the world. The children on the other side of the screen laughed merrily, delighted at such a happy ending to the story. Finally, the girl closed the fairy tale, adding that anyone could tell it in a bookstore, and the Demon King, in turn, was seriously indignant that the narrator called his story a fairy tale. Without keeping anyone waiting, the young man attacked the magical instrument, shouting that he was a blatant liar. The Demon King angrily threatened the TV that he would destroy it for such a lie and, having already cast a spell, swung his hand at it. The guy touched the display case, forgetting that in the vastness of the human world, his magical power was worth nothing at all. Passers-by were already watching this strange picture in surprise, which greatly outraged the young man. He turned fiercely in their direction, hissing that killing them would be as easy for him as moving the fingers of his left hand. People looked at the eccentric in surprise, turned around, and went about their business, adding that the guy clearly had problems with his head. The Demon King clenched his fists fiercely, muttering to himself that after so many years of greatness in hell, in the human world, he turned out to be a simple fairy tale character. The guy stood confused in the middle of the street, leaving the TV alone and staring in disappointment at the crowd. The poor fellow was all alone. He could not return to his kingdom due to the lack of magic, and even more so, people completely forgot him. The sun was already beginning to set behind the horizon, and the guy was still thinking about the fact that 3,000 years really was a huge number for people. Suddenly, the guy grabbed his stomach because for the first time he felt something strange, but very similar to the feeling of hunger. Within a moment, he caught an incredibly seductive aroma of something edible, which smelled simply wonderful. This smell brought the guy to one of the city restaurants, around which there were a lot of people. The guy carefully approached the entrance, carefully looking at everyone around him, and at the same time at the restaurant inside. Inside, there were a lot of aromas of fragrant food. The tables were filled with delicious dishes, which made the Demon King's mouth water. The waitress immediately approached the young man, greeted him nicely, and asked if he had come himself. The young man, a little confused, said that he was hungry, and the waitress concluded that the guest would be alone. Suddenly, the guy confirmed the conclusions, and the girl invited him to go to a free table. The waitress seated the Demon King at the table and brought him a menu. the sight of which increased the guy's appetite even more. He leafed through the menu and chose dishes one after another, not paying attention to prices or anything other than seductive names. Within 10 minutes, the young man's table was completely filled with a variety of dishes, from fragrant Italian pizza to Japanese rolls. Without wasting any time, the king tried a little of each dish so that he could try a little of everything first. But such patience did not last long, because within a moment the young man was crushing food on both cheeks. The king devoured the dishes with such enthusiasm that he caused other diners to stare at him curiously. However, this didn't bother him at all. The guy stuffed himself with food, slurping and smacking his lips with pleasure. In less than half an hour, mountains of empty plates and other dishes stood in front of the king, and the guy himself sat contentedly back on the sofa. Without hesitating for a long time, he got up and headed towards the exit, when suddenly the waitress, not so friendly, reminded the guest about the bill. The young man did not understand what the young lady meant, and therefore asked her again what it meant to pay the bill. Barely restraining her inner dragon, the girl clearly told the guy that he would under no circumstances leave the establishment without paying. The Demon King's expression remained unchanged, because the rules of the human world were completely unfamiliar to him. The worker angrily insisted that the guest needed to pay for such a huge number of dishes, and the guy was even more outraged since the poor thing believed that the young lady had kindly invited him to dinner. The waitress's patience was almost exhausted because she was already starting to raise her voice and order the guy not to pretend to be a deceiver. A moment later, the establishment's security approached the young man, who also refused to let him go until he paid. Those three were about to grab the intruder when suddenly a girl's voice was heard behind them, ordering them to stop. A girl suddenly appeared near them and began to defend the Demon King, ordering that he had not done anything wrong and that the number of dishes could not be considered huge. The guy looked at the stranger in surprise and thought that the girl could be from a wealthy family. The young lady in turn said with a smile that she would pay the offender's bill and the restaurant workers would have to let him go. After such words, the satisfied waitress and the guards left the guy and did not bother him. The Demon King was still staring at his savior, realizing that her voice seemed very familiar to him. The guards completely left the intruder and returned to their business, and the young lady finally got the opportunity to take a closer look at the victim of the conflict. Finally, their eyes met and both remembered and realized who they were dealing with, after which a sudden scream came from the restaurant. What flashed in the Demon King's eyes was that the young lady was exactly the girl he first saw after falling into the human world. The brunette, in turn, realized this a few seconds earlier, and therefore was already flying at the pervert with fists and insults. The self-confident king just snorted, adding that she would never be able to do something to him like that. But behind his gigantic arrogance, the guy did not pay attention to what was happening behind him, and therefore did not see the shadow approaching him. A moment later, someone grabbed him, twisted his arms and threw him to the ground, not giving the king a chance to escape. The young man could only turn his head to the side and look at his attacker. But the woman who pressed him to the ground predicted this in advance and pressed him even harder into the floor, threateningly asking who he was. Calling the guy an uninvited guest, she angrily asked whose messenger he was. The poor Demon King did not understand what was being said, and therefore only begged the woman to let him go. The attacker wrung the young man's hands even more tightly and again asked how he decided to hide in Miss Lin's room. The guy only managed to scream in pain as the woman twisted him even tighter. Restaurant visitors stood and watched with pity the interesting spectacle, not knowing how to behave. Miss Lin had already started asking Linger to stop because she was very cruel to the stranger. Linger was not going to leave the guy because, in her opinion, he deliberately burst into the young lady's room. Hearing this, the girl began to object, since there really was nothing between them. Such bold statements greatly angered the Demon King. Although he was a pagan, he had a clear conscience, so if he had magic, he definitely would not have left Linger unpunished for such insolence. From such stormy emotions, suddenly everything around the guy shone and shone so much that Linger recoiled. The woman, confused, ordered the security guards at the restaurant to protect Miss Lin, as she did not know what to expect from the pagan. Security quickly surrounded the young lady, almost completely blocking her from the outside world. The magical magic around the Demon King increased and increased until a loud and powerful boom was heard. A cloud of dust rose in the room, between which could be seen the figure of an unknown creature with horns on its head. Without expecting it, the king grabbed his chest, not understanding what had happened, and only then did it dawn on him that his magic had finally worked. The guy stood a little confused in the middle of the room and looked at the purple glow around the palms of his hands. After recovering from the explosion, Linger stood up and quickly ordered the guards to instantly catch the pagan, pointing her finger at him. The sentries slowly began to approach the king, a little afraid of him, since they also saw such a picture for the first time. It would seem that the movement towards him did not bother the Demon King at all. He stood and thought about his magical power, which until now was too weak to use again. The guards saw that the bastard had no intention of confronting them in any way and, plucking up courage, rushed towards him. Confused, Lin watched all this, still not understanding what had just happened. The girl asked Linger with concern whether she was okay, to which Linger agreed, adding that it was only a slight fall. After catching her breath a little, the woman assured the young lady that she had nothing to worry about anymore, and now they could return to the estate. However, the pursuit of the king distracted their attention so much that the girls did not notice two hefty shadows that were getting closer and closer to their souls. A moment later, Linger felt a strong male blow on her face, knocking her to the ground. Someone grabbed poor Miss Lin by the arm and pulled her to the side, causing her to scream. Two men, who were wearing black masks, grabbed the girl and dragged her along, and one of them added that a friend in the car was already waiting. Stunned, Linger quickly rose from the floor and tried to stop the criminals, but the attempt was unsuccessful. One of the thieves roughly pushed the woman away, but this time she managed to stay on her feet. The villains quickly pushed Lin into the suspicious truck, slammed the door and drove off. And Linger, in turn, did not even have time to do anything. At the same time, the Demon King was still trying to escape from the guards from the restaurant, already passing the 10th block. He couldn't tear himself away from the tail, while turning over in his head the thoughts that the guy didn't understand why his strength was restored only now. The magic that he had left would not be enough to open the portal home, so the guy could not use it against the guards again. But despite this, he still needed to get rid of the sentries and find a place where he could open the magic gate. Suddenly, a truck suddenly rushed past the guy, from which indignant screams from the driver could be heard to get out of the road. Taking a closer look at the inside of the car, the guy saw Miss Lin in it with her hands tied and a piece of tape on her lips. The guards chasing the young man instantly stopped and looked at the truck in surprise, and then at each other, not understanding what was happening. A split second later, Linger rushed near the company, trying to catch up with the car. While driving, the woman shouted for the guys to help stop the car because Miss Lin had been kidnapped. From what they heard, the guards were petrified, unable to say anything worthwhile, but after a moment they realized what had happened. The Demon King looked in surprise at Linger, who flashed past him like a fury. Two guards ran after her to keep up, while the guy looked after them and thought that he had finally gotten rid of his tail. One of the thieves noticed Linger, who was not lagging behind the truck, and he did not understand at all why that woman was chasing them. The thieves looked at each other and decided that they needed to speed up, since Linger and the guards were not lagging behind at all. One of them looked into the side mirror, watching as the trio tirelessly ran behind the car, leaving behind a huge trail of dust. Linger screamed and ordered the robbers to stop and let Miss Lin go, but it was no use as the cars only sped up. The robber, who was sitting in the passenger seat, said that they were cranky as they ran with the hope of catching up with the car. The one who was driving glanced from time to time at the frightened Lin, who, as it turned out, was the daughter of Nicholas, very much a man. As a rule, there are a lot of guards next to Lin Nicholas, and it is incredibly difficult to kidnap her. But that night, someone else took the attention of the guards, and the robbers were finally able to carry out their plan. They fed themselves with dreams of unspeakable wealth that would overtake them after the generous ransom for the girl. The thieves considered this their chance to get rich, and that is why the driver pressed the gas pedal even harder. The Demon King looked contentedly after the chase and was glad that he didn't even have to get rid of them. They disappeared on their own. But the thought of the kidnapped Lin did not leave him. The king did not know whether she could be a rich princess. The guy looked at his own hands, which had recently shimmered with enchantment, and remembered Linger, who turned out to be incredibly strong, as for a human. But instantly, he brushed aside all thoughts and decided that now he had enough power to open a magical portal. A portal began to appear in front of the young man, and he thought that it was a stupid thing for people to come into the world without any preparation. So now he needed to fix it. The guy's eyes glowed with a bright fire because he really liked the thought of defeating humanity. Despite all his problems, the king was proud that he had so successfully disguised himself among the people, hiding his horns and his true essence. As soon as he found out, the guy thought that the whole world should be proud of his courage, because no one had ever experienced such adventures as he had. Having calmed down, the young man said that the time had come and began to cast a spell, reciting a magic spell. The king addressed the elves who lived next to people and devils and called on them to obey him. He cast a wonderful magic spell and ordered the magic gate to open, after which everything around began to shine and crackle. Looking at the portal, the Demon King confidently said that he would definitely take revenge on the people when he returned next time. However, after a moment, something strange began to happen to the portal, and it gradually began to smolder and disappear. Flickering sparks rained down from the portal, and after a few seconds there was a small explosion, after which it completely disappeared. The poor ruler fell down in despair, cursing the earthly warrior and the entire human world for all his troubles. The guy ended his first day in the human world sitting in a dark alley and feeling like a nobody, and tears of despair gradually began to roll from his eyes. Linger was still tirelessly running after the car thieves and was now catching up with her, while the thieves began to become noticeably nervous since the girl was already almost on their tail. The one who was driving ordered the other not to panic and shoot the woman, since they could not lose Lynn Nicholas. A moment later, another climbed out of the car window, holding 2 pistols, and began shooting in Linger's direction. The frightened Miss Lynn mentally begged the woman to be careful as the situation became increasingly dangerous. Successfully dodging the bullets, Linger caught up with the car and, pushing off from the side of the building, tried to jump onto the roof of the car. She was quite skilled in such things, as she was well trained to guard Miss Lynn, and her main goal was to protect the young lady. Having calmed down, the Demon King gathered his strength and decided to go out into the public, because he had nothing else left to do. The guy walked down the street and was surprised that modern people had no taste, since strange clothes and relaxed behavior were not at all typical of his kingdom. The young man stared in surprise at the cars racing near him, mentally calling them metal magical objects. The guy watched passers-by and could not believe what the human world had become in 3,000 years. But Lynn Nicholas was on his mind again, because if he had a princess, the day when he could rule the human world would not be far off. Lost in his own thoughts, the king again did not see that he was on the road, and therefore again became a victim of curses from drivers who were supposed to pass him. This time the guy was not at a loss and ordered the magical object, which was faster than flying dragons, to obey him. The young man confidently jumped onto the hood of the car and slowly began to walk along it, trying to conquer the car. The stunned driver looked out of the car window and didn't understand what was happening, so he tried to somehow make the guy get off. Despite the screams from inside the car, the guy decided that he should have enough magic to do what he wanted. The angry driver even went out into the street and continued shouting at the young man, ordering him to get off and stop. The Demon King cast a spell and ordered the wind elf to take him to where the princess was now. After that, everything around him began to glow with the already familiar purple glow, and the king himself ordered the car to follow the wind and guide it to the girl. The owner of the magical metal object did not calm down and threatened the king with the police, but such threats were in vain. Instantly, the man realized that his car was out of control and he was no longer controlling it. Some otherworldly force was doing it. The now frightened owner of the car begged for help, although he was still trying to get the king to leave, while he was determined to find Miss Lynn. Linger tightly clung to the fastening on the roof of the truck, and the thieves inside could not do anything about it because they simply did not see where the woman had gone. The one behind the wheel was obviously more determined than the other, so he ordered his partner to drive the car while he had to deal with Linger. The bastard looked out of the car window, holding a pistol in his left hand, and tried to look for the woman. Linger also stayed firmly on the roof, although she noticed the robber with a weapon in his hands. Several shots were fired and the woman instinctively opened her hands, which is why she almost flew to the ground at high speed. Having caught the robber absent-mindedly, with a sharp movement of her foot she knocked the gun out of his hands, increasing her chances of success. A moment later she swung her foot at him, but at the last second the man grabbed Linger, preventing himself from being hit. The woman did not expect this at all, and therefore did not have time to grab onto anything and understood that she was about to fly down. Fear and great anxiety passed through her eyes for a moment, but she was given no other choice. The robber threw the poor girl off the car and she flew onto the road at full speed, unable to soften her own fall. Frightened Lynn, seeing Linger flying out of the car, became even more frightened, losing her healthy thinking. However, the woman was a tough nut to crack, and in a split second she had already stood up and was looking after the truck, which was quickly moving further and further away. The bastards drove up to some huge eccentric building that looked very much like some kind of abandoned warehouse. The main criminal approached their leader, carefully asking the boss what they should do now. He looked at the girl contentedly and ordered to call the man who is responsible for security in the Nicholas family and tell him about the ransom of $100 million for one finger. Poor Lin had no choice but to try to say something with his lips sealed, watching the pagans. The leader of the pack noticed that the young lady was trying to say something, so he slowly approached her. The girl's unsuccessful attempts to pronounce the word irritated him very much, so he peeled off a piece of tape, giving her the opportunity to say what she wanted. Without waiting a second, Lin attacked the kidnappers with threats and insults, repeating that Linger would definitely save her. One of the thieves decided to make fun of him and said that if the young lady was talking about the same woman, then she had already been dead a long time ago after falling from the car. Suddenly, the girl fell silent, speechless, only squeezing out a few words, asking the man whether the woman really died. The leader laughed loudly, adding that once they received the ransom for the girl, Lin would be able to leave and look for her body. Tears rolled from the young lady's eyes and she began to scream that the man was blatantly lying. Instantly, the attention of those present was attracted by the loud sounds of clapping coming from the entrance to the train. All three kidnappers, along with Lin, turned their heads in surprise and saw the incredible... A car drove up to the train, around which everything shimmered and glowed with a purple glow, and on its roof was the Demon King, frozen in a confident pose. The bastards immediately exploded and began to run around Miss Lin in panic, trying to somehow protect her and repel the threat. The girl didn't even understand who had arrived and why everyone was fussing so much, and therefore she immediately thought about Linger, who had come to save her. The magical transport finally stopped, and the unfortunate driver, still sitting inside, hit his head on the steering wheel so that the airbag flew out. The Demon King spread his legs wide and folded his arms across his chest, confidently declaring that he had arrived. Addressing her princess height, he put out his hand, pointing his finger at the thief and ordered the magical object on wheels to move forward. The cars roared sharply and rushed into the crowd, causing the pagans to jump back in all directions. The young man smiled at this, making sure that the men were ordinary cowards who were afraid of the usual trick. But besides them, poor Miss Lin was also frightened. But right in front of her nose, the car braked sharply, without hitting her at all. The young lady narrowed her eyes out of fear, but feeling that nothing had happened, she opened them wide again. The guy jumped off the hood of the car, took a few steps, and snapped his fingers, ordering the girl to follow him. However, the girl was in no hurry because she still didn't really trust the stranger who brazenly burst into her bath that morning. Noticing the fear in her eyes, the guy asked her superiority to wait until he dealt with all the intruders, after which he would take her back to the castle. With her mouth open, the girl could barely ask him what he was doing there, since this guy was the last person she expected to see. The Demon King mercifully extended his hand to the lady, informing her that he had come to save her. The girl looked at the young man gratefully, very surprised at such good deeds on his part, arrived up in the car, and his partners opened fire. With lightning speed, one of the balls passed right through the guy's body, while he was still holding the frightened girl's hand. The young man turned his head in surprise, saying that it was black magic and doubting that he could completely underestimate those cowards. Poor Lin was horrified by such a sight. The girl was shaking and sobbing, covering her mouth with her hands. The young lady did not understand why the guy had to save her, since they were complete strangers, and this rescue cost him his life. The Demon King fell motionless to the ground, and one of the thieves, snorting, added that he considered him some more important type and not an ordinary blockhead. The pack boss laughed again, saying that he would be very interested to see who else would come to save the girl, when suddenly a figure appeared behind him, ordering them all to stop immediately. The husband returned and, smiling sarcastically, was glad that another of their victim's friends had decided to come to his certain death. Linger suddenly burst into the building with a mosque in her hands, and she instantly took a fighting stance, letting everyone know that there was nowhere to run. Seeing a familiar face, the thieves opened fire on the woman again, trying to completely remove her. But this time they couldn't do it so easily, as Linger skillfully ran through the bullets, not giving any of them a chance to ram her body. Seeing this, the leader of the company looked with fear in his eyes at this crazy woman who was getting closer to him. All three looked at her, deciding that Linger was a complete monster because she survived the fall and found the strength to return. A second later, two of the kidnappers lay with broken noses and bloodied faces. Linger only turned her head in their direction, adding with a slight smile that these tramps deserved to die. Not even a minute had passed. The Demon King lay on the floor next to a pool of blood and thought that he should have been the hero of this story. Lin, who had been talking to her bodyguard, suddenly remembered that she had completely forgotten. The young lady pointed her finger at the poor guy, saying that he had come to save her, but now he seemed dead. Listening to all this, the king waited until his magical power was finally restored, but now he was motionless and could only helplessly blink his eyes, Within a second, women's screams were heard from the building because Lin noticed that the guy clicked his right eye while the police were already gathering around the train. Quite unexpectedly, after some time, the guy ended up on the estate of the Nicholas family because he won the girl's heart with his nobility. The guy sat in the hot bath and regretted a little that princesses no longer existed in the modern human world. But despite this, a new invasion plan was ripening in his head, in which he could use this sub-princess. Lin, who was standing on the other side of the bathroom, added that she was only the youngest daughter of the Nicholas family, not a princess, while the guy, in her opinion, seemed to her to be homeless without a penny in his pocket. The girl invited the young man to live with her, but he took this invitation as an attempt to recruit him as a servant, to which the king reacted violently. But even though he didn't have the ability to bring 30,000 demons into the human world now, and the Lin estate was well guarded, he could actually stay there. The guy was frightened by wizards with tools of black magic, as well as by the monster Linger, who really was an incredibly strong warrior. Remembering her, the guy decided that he needed to run away, because although he had a lot of time, it was unsafe to stay there. Days passed and life in the big city did not stop for a second, setting a lively rhythm for all its inhabitants. The Demon King had no money in his bosom at all, and the banal rental of housing in that anthill cost exorbitant sums for him. The guy had no choice but to wander the city streets without any strength to survive in the human world. Even a small human boy, who was 95 years younger than him, managed to mock the guy. The boy stepped on him with a toy gun, threateningly saying that he was going to kill the king. The poor guy couldn't believe that even a child could be so cruel, so he didn't believe in the seriousness of the situation until the very end. As soon as the boy pretended to shoot at the guy, he immediately stepped back, grimacing in fear. The kid just laughed merrily, telling his mother that some weirdo was scared of his toy gun. The Demon King stood up and realized that he had been tricked by the toy weapon and was actually completely safe. At that time, the little robber's mother explained to her son that such behavior was completely unsightly, since the baby simply scared the stranger. Such humiliation hit his demonic king very hard. The poor fellow knelt down in the middle of the asphalt and feebly hit the ground with his fists. He felt like a weakling as even a human child looked down on him. But because of this, his rage only grew, and the guy was already planning how in a month he would completely conquer the worthless human world. In a fit of emotion, the king stood up and, almost exclaiming, said that he would definitely show people what would happen if they angered the Demon King. One sunny morning, people were definitely walking along one of the city's underground passages, hurrying to work. In that passage, there usually sat a strange man who looked like a monk, and at the same time baked delicious pancakes. The poor guy was so hungry that he ended up begging for food from street hustlers, but it was not at all easy to take the food from the man, since he constantly stopped the young man's attempts to steal the pancakes. The weak and almost exhausted guy hopelessly sat down in front of the stranger and tried to beg him. Lowering his head, he apologized to the man for the mistake and asked to share half of the pancake with him, and the scammer really liked such stares. The old man saw the rare potential of a talented beggar in the guy and invited the king to learn this skill from him. Obediently shaking his head, the Demon King politely agreed to such a proposal. Leaning over and smiling maliciously, the young man even added that he was ready to be his husband's slave. The man said with satisfaction that in this case he had taught the young man a wonderful first lesson, after which he handed him a pancake, which he immediately pounced on. Immediately taking the whole pancake, the guy began to give the old man goodbye, and the man, in turn, only managed to call him a swindler. The man even became a little sad, for the 10th time disappointed in modern youth, for whom nothing can help. He believed that children were really wasting their own time, which they should value. That old man turned out to be the leader of a whole gang of beggars, who was one of the best of his kind, and was quite convinced that not everyone could master such a skill. Almost a month has passed since the meeting with the strange man, and now the king's permanent habitat turned out to be the most ordinary alley with garbage dumps. Suddenly, a stranger began to approach the guy with a confident step. Her path was blocked by the sleeping Demon King, who was lying down right in the middle of the alley right under the landfill. The girl looked at the poor guy in surprise, telling G that there was someone lying in the middle of the garbage. The guy had his 10th dream with a bunch of food, which made him talk in his sleep, and the girl, in turn, carefully sat down next to him and tried to wake him up. She gently grabbed his shoulder and told him that if he continued to sleep in the same place, he would end up in a landfill, like ordinary trash. The guy slowly opened his eyes, looking at the young lady in surprise and asking who she was. But without waiting for an answer, He exploded and said that the girl had no right to say that, since he was not the kind of thieves who were thrown away like garbage, and even more so, he was not going to show kindness to the woman. Suddenly, a bag of fast food came from somewhere in the stranger's hand, and she got annoyed and waved it in front of the guy's eyes. As soon as he saw this package, the king immediately changed his facial expression, trying to get what he wanted. He knelt down and began to beg the good beautiful lady to forgive him, because it was the will of fate itself that they would meet and she would feed him. The girl gave him a package of food and the guy sat down to greedily bite his cheeks, while the young lady tried to ask him about where his home was, not believing the stories about the demon. The young man stuffed a burger into both cheeks, and the girl asked where his parents were, probably worried about him. Instantly, the stranger touched his forehead, adding that the guy seemed crazy to her, since he called himself the Demon King. Such bold statements extremely outraged the guy, and he menacingly declared that he really was the Demon King who had come to conquer the human world. The girl came to terms with such strange statements and, waving her hand, told the king that she needed his help. They walked along some strange street, which did not at all resemble the city that the guy had visited before, since in this part of it there were no huge skyscrapers and large crowds of people. Finally, an eccentric store called the Demon King loomed in front of them, to which the young lady headed, pulling the guy along with her. The girl entered and loudly called the bespectacled man, who was clearly the owner of this amazing place. They asked him if he wanted to accept a 12-inch black and white TV from 1960 without any damage when he crossed the threshold of the shop. The guy was in such a hurry that he did not notice the roll of carpet under him and accidentally slipped on it. The poor guy flew head over heels across the room, kicking his feet in the air. The bespectacled boy landed right at the exit of the store, feeling dizzy and breaking his nose a little. The girl didn't even raise an eyebrow, straight to the point in saying that she brought him to the Demon King because the bespectacled man was simply obsessed with various mystical things. The guy opened his eyes in surprise and asked again if she was really talking about the Demon King. The girl laughed loudly, later adding that she was just joking, which slightly disappointed the young man. She told the bespectacled man that the guy simply called himself the Demon King, and her friend had always been a good person, and that's why the young lady hinted to him to take the guy to her place. The guy looked at his friend in surprise, not expecting such a request from her. The girl in turn called the guy, nicknamed him the village boy who was to blame for her hamburger. Snorting, the Demon King cautiously walked into the store, immediately making a sour grimace. Glasses immediately began to protest, since hiring children to work was illegal, and the king clearly did not look very mature. However, the young lady pointed at the guy and said that this boy absolutely had secrets that he would be interested in knowing. The girl turned around and headed towards the exit of the store, leaving the guys alone. She waved her hand at them sweetly, ordering the Demon King to obey the bespectacled boy, or else he would become a regular research subject. After these words, the young lady burst into an even wider smile, cheerfully adding that in the end, the unfortunate one would simply be gutted. The guys were left alone and the Demon King was the first to speak, asking the bespectacled man what kind of place it was. He also suggested that the girl could well be a dark witch, as evidenced by her dark hair and eccentricity. The bespectacled man looked at the new employee with a pantaletic look and finally told him that from that moment on he became his boss. The guy immediately laughed, thinking that boss was the name of the bespectacled man, and the bespectacled man himself at that moment thought that he would have absolutely thrown out this rogue if not for Coria's request. The guy said that the king could stay living in the store, but he had to work conscientiously to earn his roof over his head and food. The young man was surprised, and once again asked, puzzled, whether accommodation and meals were really included. Realizing that he had heard everything correctly, the Demon King began to beg the bespectacled man to take him to work, since without a roof over his head, he simply would not survive. Having settled in a new place, the king developed a new plan, the first step of which was to hide his identity and learn about the human world. A bespectacled man flew into the guy's room with a stick in his hand, which he loudly tapped on the frying pan to wake up the poor guy, because it was time to get to work. The young man stood up and immediately set to work, thinking about the second step of his plan, which was to find a way to return to his kingdom. He helped the bespectacled man with various studies and at the same time thought about the third point of the plan, according to which he needed to gather an army and go back to the human world. The last step of the plan was to conquer the human world, the thought of which made the guy jump out of bed. He didn't have much time to have his head in the clouds, since the bespectacled man forced the guy to work. Thus, the guy thanked him for temporary shelter and food, so he humbly bowed his head and went to work and help. Since he was hired, one customer finally visited the store, which was rare. A little girl approached the door, obviously embarrassed to go inside, but she tried her best to overcome her fear. The kid was serious, so after standing in front of the door for a few more minutes, she finally decided to enter. The girl carefully opened the door, muttering that she would definitely find her younger brother. A moment later, she was sitting at the table in front of the bespectacled man, having finished telling the story of her brother's disappearance. The bespectacled boy ran his eyes over his notes and asked if this was the whole story, to which the young lady agreed and added that neither the adults nor the police believed her. He looked at the girl uncertainly and said that it was most likely that her brother was kidnapped by ordinary human thieves. But suddenly the girl said that this thief looked terrible. He had huge horns, and it seemed to her that he was a real monster. Hearing about the horns, the Demon King turned in surprise towards the young lady, trying to hear something else. The bespectacled boy asked the girl if he had a mask because in his practice the guy did a lot of research to find out about the existence of monsters, but all of them were in vain. The girl was ready to rely on the fact that it really was a monster, and it was not her imagination at all. The guy didn't pay attention to this, turned around and added that the police would have handled this case much better than he did. And it was time for He introduced himself as the Demon King and invited the girl to take her to this monster, where together they could save her brother, which made her very happy. The guy walked and thought that he didn't remember his subordinates at all, who could have such terrible beauty. They walked along a huge spacious boulevard on which there was a bunch of people because it was Saturday and people were resting. Having reached the place where the young lady led him, the guy was surprised because he did not at all expect that they would return there again. The girl said that the monster kidnapped her brother and ran away, climbing over the huge wall towering in front of them. The Demon King touched it carefully and felt something familiar from there, and it was not the cold from the damp concrete at all, but rather a familiar magical atmosphere. He walked up to the little lady with a smile and said that he knew where to look for her little brother. Not believing her ears, the girl happily asked him if it was true. The guy stood up contentedly and assured the girl that he was fluent in the necessary magic. He began to cast a spell and order the Earth Elf to look for a place where strong magical power was felt. Dark purple arrows appeared in the air, indicating the way, and the girl just shouted that the Demon King was incredible. He took the lady's hand and said that they need to follow these arrows and follow them because they tell the right way. The signs led them under one of the bridges over the river, and the girl, a little doubtfully, asked the guy if her brother had really disappeared here. The guy said that her brother was simply hidden with the help of a spell, a very simple spell that only one subject could charm. The young man cast a spell, ordered the sesame to open and waved his hand towards the portal site. A huge portal in the other world appeared in front of the Demon King, which flickered and twisted with a purple glow. He patted the girl on the head, promising her that he would definitely return her to her brother safe and sound. The girl believed the guy and was sincerely happy because she didn't even know who else to turn to. The king ordered her to wait for him there, and he himself slowly entered the portal and subsequently disappeared into it. A moment later, the portal closed, and in its place there remained a small spark and the same little lady who politely remained waiting for the king. It's quite cool. So the young lady had already managed to freeze a little, and the young man still had not appeared. Suddenly, someone behind her asked what the kids were doing there at such a late time and alone. The girl turned and saw her mother behind her, who was staring at her in surprise. The poor woman could not find a place for herself since the girl simply ran away from home. She asked her daughter why she ran away and suggested that she return home, because it was indeed deep night outside. Tears appeared in the eyes of the kids, and carefully wiping them away with her finger, the girl refused. She told her mother that she was waiting for her little brother because she hoped that this time he would definitely be found. Hanging her nose, the woman lowered her eyes guiltily and not finding anything to answer, simply remained silent. She approached her daughter and hugged her tenderly, telling the kids that the police would definitely find their brother, but she just needed to trust. The girl quietly said that she believed her mother, but the Demon King still remained in the portal, because of which she could not go home. The mother decided not to hesitate, so she took the girl by the hand and led her home. The kid had no choice but to simply stare at the place where the portal used to be and hope that everything was fine with the guy. Her eyes showed fear for the guy since he voluntarily decided to save her brother, and now he was in trouble himself. The king, in turn, found himself in front of a hefty building with huge columns, which in its structure was very reminiscent of classicism. The guy slowly began to climb the stairs, amazed at such greatness and realizing that the monster inside was far from one of the most ordinary. The atmosphere around that building glowed with magical power that the guy had not felt for a long time. He marveled at the enormous power of magic and wondered who could be inside. Inside the building, one could see a pile of saucers with a burning fire inside. In the middle of the room, on the table, lay a little boy, whose hair color was very similar to the hair of the little girl for whom the king went to the world of demons. A black, terrifying monster with huge horns on its head stood near the boy and was about to do something evil. After seeing the Demon King, he returned and congratulated him in his own home with a smile, adding that he did not expect such guests at all. The guy looked at the demon and was surprised that he was able to create such a strong love spell and create a powerful barrier of magical power around him. The demon smiled sarcastically and said that he was awarded gifts by the Lord himself. The Demon King snorted and, folding his arms, ordered the monster to let the boy go and help him return to hell. The devil laughed menacingly and refused, since the boy was a special material for his magical practice. In addition, he laughed ironically, saying that according to the Lord, the Demon King had lost his magical power and became a complete nobody. The guy looked at him with an indifferent gaze, turning over in his head how he could take revenge on the impudent man. Instantly, the demon returned to the guy and, pointing a knife at him, said with curiosity what could have happened if he had killed the king. Without waiting for an answer, the monster attacked the guy, rhetorically asking whether he would receive a reward from the Lord for this murder. Having almost attacked the king, he only revealed that he would never know about it until he tried. And even more so, he had been practicing murder for 3,000 years due to the disappearance of the portal to hell. Some kind of magical barrier prevented the demon from attacking the king, so he missed and flew in the other direction. Just as indifferently, the guy was sarcastically disappointed by such a huge failure. The puzzled demon stood and did not understand how the guy could get away from his blow because, according to rumors, he no longer had magical power. With great anger in his eyes, the Demon King looked at the monster and hissed that he was probably a deserter in the war with humanity, and today he had betrayed his king once again. The monster looked at the young man in fear, realizing that the Lord had blatantly lied to him. The guy approached the weak demon with a smile and menacingly asked if he knew why he still managed to be king. Without waiting for an answer, the young man said that even without magical power, his body remained the best magical source, which always had a lot of power, after which the guy charmed one of the most powerful spells. The room burst into flames, and the demon ran away trying to save his own skin. But the fire was much more dexterous, so it immediately caught up with the monster when he only begged the king to have mercy and let him go. Suddenly, the magic caught up with the demon and he burst into flames, still begging the Demon King for mercy because of the screams. The guy carefully brushed the particles of ash from his shoulder and said with satisfaction that he could finally charm something more powerful than the usual tricks for elves. The familiar horns that appeared there every time he used magic suddenly appeared on his head again. 2 shining balls instantly appeared in the guy's hands, which gradually grew larger and larger. The king summoned the highest magic of the Spear of Erebus and the Arrow of Artemis, and calling the monster a traitor, was going to send him to trial. The little young lady lay restlessly in her bed, unable to sleep due to disturbing thoughts. She was reproached by the thought that while the Demon King was probably fighting for her brother, she was lying helpless in bed. Instantly, these thoughts struck her and the girl exploded out of bed, quickly getting dressed and deciding that she couldn't sit still. The young lady was determined to run away and look for her brother along with the Demon King. She quietly stepped on the floor and walked on her toes to the door, trying not to wake anyone, after which she carefully opened it and left the house. The girl ran through the dark streets of the city where there were not even lanterns, only begging her brother to wait for her. She hoped that he and the Demon King were still in that portal, or were at least close to that place. The magic spell ended, and all that was left of the black demon was blackened ashes and a chewed dagger that fell to the floor with a crash. The guy stood and thought about that eccentric lord who possessed such enormous power that he was able to conjure such a terrible spell. Suddenly, stones fell from the ceiling, and the building itself trembled and made noise, preparing for destruction. Seeing how a huge block broke off from the rock and flew down, the guy immediately realized that the highest magical power had its side effects. The terrible Demon King instantly remembered the boy for whom he came to this demon world. The young man immediately jumped out of his seat when a huge stone column fell in front of him, blocking his path. But he was not at all confused, jumping over the obstacle and heading to save the boy. The king carefully grabbed the baby, after which a large stone fell right on the place where the boy lay. The pleased ruler carried the unfortunate man in his arms through the portal, proud that he managed to save the boy. But as soon as the guy stepped towards the human world, he immediately realized one unpleasant thing. Within a moment, the Demon King was screaming as he flew to the ground from a bird's eye view, holding the boy tightly in his arms. This time, the guy was a little more lucky with the place of the fall, because both landed rather softly in a huge puddle. The young lady was still running resolutely to the place of the portal, still asking someone if everything was fine with her brothers. The king, carefully holding the boy, past the cold grass, which had already become covered with dew. Seeing the young lady, he asked the girl to come up and help him with his brother, because he was still unconscious. Seeing them, the girl screamed joyfully and ran to the guys, as she had already begun to lose hope. While the Demon King stumbled away from the side, she tried to wake up her brother, who was still lying motionless, only breathing. Finally, the boy opened his eyes, barely finding the strength to say something to his sister. The young lady's joy simply knew no bounds. She pounced on the baby and hugged him until his bones crunched. The king looked at them with a smile on his face, surprised that he had just helped a man on Earth. The guy peered into one of the most beautiful sunsets, assuring himself that good deeds made him feel better. Not understanding where such a loud noise was coming from, the bespectacled man sat down on the bed, puzzled, scratching the back of his head. He opened the door, deciding that the Demon King should be severely punished since the guy had disappeared somewhere that night. But noticing a bunch of people behind the window, the bespectacled man's face changed dramatically. The people on the other side were trying to find out if the Demon King lived there, holding a bunch of flowers and gifts for him in their hands. The guy himself, in turn, was already lively, giving an interview to some journalist who was obviously interested in magic. But as soon as he saw the camera, the guy became wary again. Not understanding what kind of magical object it was with darkness inside, the cameraman, smiling sheepishly, told him that it was only a camera and asked if he could ask him a few questions. Miss Lin and Linger were watching the news when the girl noticed a familiar face on the screen. She called Linger and pointed at the screen to show her that this fugitive was shown on TV. The girl listened in surprise to the story, in which the guy was called a hero of youth, which the lady was surprised at, since he seemed to her like a habitual idiot. Linger also listened attentively to the news, folding her arms menacingly across her chest, but she was somewhat unsure. She couldn't believe that a guy like the Demon King could actually act so kindly. But at the same time, the girl cried out that the stranger had saved her from the robbers. Linger, in turn, only shook her head negatively, adding that he did it for his own benefit. The girl screamed her name outrageously, making it clear that she completely disagreed with her friend's opinion. Noticing this, Linger politely apologized for her rude words because she really had a very ambiguous attitude towards the guy. Miss Lin smiled affectionately, saying that she understood why Linger didn't trust strangers. Bowing her head slightly, she looked down as she knew that even though it was professional, Lin already had a lot of impatience because of whose daughter she was. Suddenly, a voice was heard in the corridor, turning to the ladies to tell them there was a butler outside the door of the room who reported that the driver was already waiting for them. He added that if the lady was already ready, it was time for them to go, or the miss would be late for school. Lynn Nicholas was a sweet and simple-minded girl, but with a difficult life. Walking towards the huge black limousine, she thought about her fate of being born into a wealthy family, which is why the girl lived without any worries. The young lady waved politely to Mr. Dickens as he wished her a good day, but not everyone thought Lynn Nicholas was all that nice. The car started moving, and the girl, waving to the butler a second time, rushed into her own thoughts. Sometimes her own life simply killed her, but she had no choice but to remain strong. The girl looked sadly out the window and dreamed of an ordinary life, in which there was no danger and constant risks. The Demon King at that time was simply enraged when he saw his face in a small box called a TV. He shook the magic box, not understanding what to do and believing that it was some kind of trick. A bespectacled man entered the room and, yawning, told the guy to calm down and not act like a fool. He looked at him indifferently, adding that it was only television that the young man was exposed to, after which he turned around and, heading towards the exit, ordered to start work when the king stopped feeling happy, because the opening was soon. Korea came to the store that day and praised the Demon King for his courage and for helping others. She said that although the thief had finally left, what the guy did was quite a strong act. The young man looked at the girl in surprise, wondering how she knew this and believing that the girl was a witch, since she learned about it from nowhere. Korea laughed loudly at his words about the witch and said that television was much more effective than the witch in the modern world. Instantly, the girl turned her head towards the bespectacled man, who finally left the room, having overcome his shame. The girl put a large wad of bills on the table and moved it towards the bespectacled man, The guy, in turn, slipped her an envelope saying that it contained all the information and theoretical explanations for his speculations. The girl smiled, calling the guy her jewel, because without him it would be very difficult for her. The young lady turned around and took out sunglasses, after which she put them on her nose and made a serious grimace of an important person. She headed to the door, saying that she was looking forward to meeting again and saying goodbye. The alarm clock struck 8 in the morning, which meant the guy's official weekly day off had finally arrived. The joyful Demon King exploded out of bed, thinking that he had a chance to start a new investigation. He got ready and went outside, again turning over in his mind the thoughts that the human world had changed incredibly in 3,000 years. The guy walked down the street, realizing that kings, like nobles, no longer existed, and there was no need to think about knights. Suddenly stopping at a traffic light, the guy saw in front of him a woman with an eccentric hairstyle that reminded him of a warrior, but the young man rejected this idea. He continued to scan the anxious crowd, reassuring himself once again that once his army attacked, the people wouldn't stand a chance. But despite this, he still remembered the tools of magic or alchemy, which seemed incredible to him. The guy remembered the contract between people and science, and, smiling contentedly, he believed that someday he would take advantage of it. With such slow steps, he finally came to the place where he had last opened the portal to save the boy. The guy looked at his own hands, regretting that there were no signs of fluctuations in magical power. The guy was ashamed for using absolute magic to show off his own coolness. He fell to his knees and sobbed, covering his face with his hand in shame and regret for being so stupid. But his consolation was the 1,000 yuan bill that the guy took out of his pocket. This was his first honestly earned money, which the bespectacled man gave him as a reward for his courage. He also added that the king should not invent anything unnecessary for himself, because his story was simply a good advertisement for the shop. The young man tightly squeezed what people called money in his hand and felt a little happy. He happily declared that he should take advantage of this opportunity and fully enjoy using them. The guy decided to head to a Chinese restaurant because the restaurant was famous for its cheap prices and incredibly tasty noodles. There was a legend in the restaurant that no one could ever eat more than 5 cups of noodles, and the Demon King was dead set on breaking this record. Within a few minutes, the king was happily devouring his 10th plate of the most delicious noodles in the city. Having eaten his fill, the guy put his hands on his stomach and leaned back on the sofa, concluding that the noodles there really were incredible. The guy left the restaurant and thought that the portions in the restaurant were not terribly large, so all the gossip about the unbroken record seemed like a lie to him. The king walked down the street joyful and well-fed, knowing that by the end of that day there was still a lot of time left for investigation. Suddenly, in the middle of the street, he saw a familiar girl who was wearing a cap and a white mask, and a yellow backpack was visible on her back. He looked at her in surprise, trying to make sure that he was thinking about the right person, because in his opinion, Miss Lin's wealth could not allow her to appear in the middle of the street like this. The young man carefully approached and took the girl by the hand, which made her shudder and return to him. Lin embarrassedly scratched the back of her head and jokingly added that they had not seen each other for a long time, to which the guy asked her where she came from. The Demon King took the girl with him to the bespectacled man's shop and treated her to coffee, surprised that even the young lady who lived in the castle decided to run away from it. Hearing this, the girl became a little sad, saying that if the guy were a person, he wouldn't talk like that. The guy indifferently dismissed her words, adding that he was not going to explain anything to a primitive person. Lin didn't pay any attention to this, so she continued to say that even though she lived in the castle, she didn't feel happy there. Hanging her nose, the beauty quietly said that she only dreamed of becoming as smart as her sister. But suddenly she rejected the sad thoughts and thanked the Demon King for her own salvation, which resulted in injuries for him. The guy was a little embarrassed, but tried to bring up the topic, saying that nothing terrible happened at all in what happened. But deep down, he didn't like it at all because he brought shame on himself, and then one person stole his show. Despite this, a little shyly, the girl tried to talk about when they first met. The young man looked at her in surprise, not understanding what the young lady was leading to, and asked her again. Miss Lin blushed all over, but decided to ask whether his actions were intentional that morning when he fell on her house. This question seriously outraged the guy, and he began to aggressively prove that he was completely innocent of where he landed. Beauty looked at him doubtfully, ordering him not to lie, or Linger would simply kill him if he found out that it was intentional. Without dragging the cat by the tail, the guy almost pounced on her, reminding her that he was the victim in this situation, because it was the guards and the girl who attacked him. Lin completely disagreed with his opinion and therefore stated that the guy was simply pretending to be beaten because she could not be so strong. The guy did not give up and told the girl to look at his neck, showing the place of the blow with his index finger. The young lady just as firmly stood her ground, repeating that the guy was simply portraying a beaten poor fellow. It was at this tense moment that the bespectacled man entered the room with a toothbrush and a cup in his hand to tell the king that he had taken his toothpaste. But noticing that a real battle was taking place in the room, the bespectacled man only froze in confusion and surprise. The lovebirds, who continued to quarrel, did not even pay attention to the poor guy, who remained standing at the door. But out of the conviction of respect and upbringing, the bespectacled man bowed, apologizing for what he had demanded, and left. Lin and the king noticed this only after the door slammed, after which they tried to stop the bespectacled man so that he would not think anything unnecessary. They sat and played in awkward silence for the next few minutes, not even looking at each other. Lin said that it was all the king's fault, which he simply shrugged off, adding that he thought people were smarter. The Demon King lay alone on a makeshift bed in the middle of the store's attic, staring at the ceiling. He was tormented by thoughts about why the bespectacled man made him sleep right there, in that terrible place. The young man did not understand why Lin did not have money for a regular hotel room, because now she was asking to stay for a few days in the shop. Suddenly, the guy threw away all the disturbing thoughts, turned over to the other side, and, mentally calling all the people idiots, began to sniffle sweetly. Mrs. Lin, at that time, had just come out of the shower, rubbing her wet hair with a terry towel and mentally thinking that the guy's shampoo was terrible. The girl joyfully rushed to the large window that was in her room to look at the bright stars. She carefully leaned on the windowsill and looked admiringly at the old moon, which sparkled so well in the middle of the sky, thinking that her usual life was about to begin. The next morning, when the lovebirds happened to be in the bathroom to brush their teeth, the guy decided to ask Lin why she didn't rent a hotel room instead of taking his room. Without taking the toothbrush out of her mouth, the girl asked him in surprise what a hotel was. Realizing that the girl was far from such things, the king mockingly asked if she knew about amusement parks, to which she replied that she had never been to such a place. The guy didn't give up and decided to ask the Chinese restaurant he had been to a few days ago. But the girl's answer remained unchanged. She still did not know about any of the places the young man spoke about. The Demon King began to list a bunch of common places usually visited by familiar people while continuing to brush his teeth. Such persistence began to irritate the young lady a little, and she said that a guy doesn't have to put such a burden on himself. The young man laughed, saying that surprisingly he, the Demon King, knew much more about human things than a real person. After rinsing her mouth and putting down the glass, the girl turned to the guy and decided to ask him something. With a sarcastic intonation, the young lady asked if he had ever heard of the quantum transition, or the theory of relativity, or whether he could write the same symbol in 4 different ways. The puzzled guy froze with a toothbrush in his mouth, not knowing what to answer and surprised that one character could be written in different ways. But without being confused, he firmly and seriously added that he did not need all this information at all. Convinced that the king was weak inside, the girl said contentedly that praising him with such nonsense greatly betrayed him. Lin came out of the bathroom a winner, while the king was annoyed by her every word and called the young lady shameless. During breakfast, the tension between them only worsened, and the poor bespectacled man awkwardly tried to defuse the situation by calling on his friends to have breakfast. He pretended to be a fool, not understanding why there was such a strange atmosphere around him. Unable to withstand the tension, the guy left the room and, propping up the door, was relieved that it was all over. For him, all this was equivalent to going because of the war, because the reason for everything was his sadness. The young man knelt down, thinking about how one person, after 28 years of self-control, managed to disturb his peaceful psyche. The Lin remaining at the table with the Demon King decided to compete, because both leaders could not so easily live in the same house. The young man's condition was that the loser would be called a village dog for the rest of his life. Smiling maliciously, Lin supported the bet and, calling the guy a country dog, declared that she would come out of the water dry. The bright sun flooded the room with its warm rays, signaling the beginning of a new, beautiful day. In the middle of a park full of people, Lin sat alone on a bench and carefully examined the passers-by. Suddenly, she saw a familiar figure coming towards her, very reminiscent of Linger. She approached the young lady and sat down next to her, and the girl only politely thanked her friend, which she simply shrugged off. Lin laughed sweetly, asking Linger to stop talking so seriously around her. Linger, in turn, only smiled lightly, saying that she had found a wonderful home for the young lady into which she could move at any time. After warming up a little, Lynn said that her current housing was not so bad because the owner warmly agreed for her to live with him, and this was an opportunity to save on rent. Linger suddenly changed her face, angrily declaring that living with this pervert could be dangerous. Lynn looked at her in surprise, not understanding why her friend remembered this again. The girl began to justify her friend because she really considered him good after he saved her. And then that little boy. But Lynn did feel happier. She assured Linger that she was able to take care of herself. The girl told her friend that she began to feel this from the moment she ran away from home, which was a prison for her. Seeing the fervor in Mrs. eyes, Linger felt a little calmer than her because the girl could really survive in the cruel world without her. But despite this, the woman stood up and said that she would try to keep the situation in the castle under control. But Lynn would need to do one favor for her. She said they needed to see each other as little as possible over the next few days, except for emergencies, of course. Mrs. Lynn happily threw herself on the woman's neck, saying that she would miss her very much. Meanwhile, the bespectacled man in the shop had guests who were politely sitting at the table and apparently having lunch. The bespectacled man himself, in turn, gave orders to the Demon King in every possible way, ordering him to serve tea for the guests. 3 guys who were his friends, hearing this name, buzzed in surprise, asking if they were talking about the right king. The bespectacled man just started to brush it off, saying that the guy was just a hired worker with a strange nickname. The puzzled king did not understand why he should serve strangers. All 4 looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he meant. The bespectacled boy stood up, approached the guy, and began to explain that his duties included serving guests, which he clearly did not agree with. The already irritated bespectacled man said that the 3 were the foundation of the progress of the Demon King Forum, so they absolutely needed to be appeased. The young man brushed off the owner's words, saying that it was a regular forum that they managed, and his name actually had nothing to do with it. In the blink of an eye, something rang and vibrated in his pocket, making the guy forget about the bespectacled man's request. The Demon King took out his phone and saw a message there from Lolita, the young lady who had helped him, asking him to take her home after school. Lynn and the guy again found themselves in the place where the guy had previously opened the portal. The young man irritably asked Miss Lynn why she constantly followed him and whether she had a school that she had to go to like all children. To this, the girl sharply stated that going to school was pointless because she simply ran away from home. The beauty asked the guy if he went to that place every day after work. Without understanding what came over him, the king decided to blatantly lie to the girl that he was going on a date. The girl looked at him indifferently, almost not surprised, asking who was so stupid as to agree to a date with him. Smiling widely, the young man showed the young lady Lolita's message, where she wrote that she needed to meet somewhere around 6. Lynn carefully scanned the boy's phone, rereading the message from the girl. A little offendedly, folding her arms across her chest, the young lady said that the guy was calling the usual kidnapping of a young girl a date. Snorting, the king said that the girl didn't even know anything about the hotel, but at the same time, she told him something about the girl's abduction. Unable to bear such impudence, Lynn fiercely screamed at him to shut up and call him a pet dog. Unable to find anything to answer to the young lady, the Demon King boldly declared that the girl's stomach would suffer from the fact that she ate quickly. The young lady turned her nose in the other direction and, lifting it up a little, said that the guy had no right to judge her at all. The Demon King did not expect such impudence, but as soon as he returned to burn something out to the girl, he suddenly heard his name. The guy returned and saw Lolita joyfully running towards him, waving her hand welcomingly. Seeing her, Lynn calmed down a little and the young man burst into a smile, adding that soon the knight would take his princess home. Poor Lolita hid behind the guy because Lynn called her a scary woman and was afraid of her. Noticing this, the guy ordered the kids to ignore the stranger because she didn't even know the difference between karaoke and a bar. Annoyed, Miss Lynn once again called her a shameless loser and a house dog. She knelt down in front of Lolita affectionately, saying that she was not scary at all, unlike the Demon King. Hearing this, Lolita strictly ordered her not to say bad things about the king. At this, the Demon King laughed incredibly, adding that the people on Earth received him very well. Lynn snorted with displeasure at hearing such nonsense from the guy and walked forward resentfully. All 3 went for a walk together, and little Lolita tightly squeezed the king's hand, glancing at Lynn from time to time. She didn't like something about the young lady, and the kids couldn't take their eyes off her. Even when friends visited a cafe for ice cream, instead of enjoying it, Lolita stared at the young lady. Towards evening, the king and Lynn finally walked the girl home, waving sweetly at her at the end. Lolita's gaze towards Lynn did not change. And besides, when saying goodbye, she called the girl a hateful woman. The Demon King laughed cheerfully, adding that he was looking forward to meeting again. And Lin just smiled shyly and waved her hand. After that, the friends went on a journey home, which passed through a bunch of dark alleys. Upset by the kid's reaction, Lin walked with her nose down, trying to ask the guy if she was really that unpleasant, to which he disagreed. Miss looked at him incredulously, not understanding his hidden motives, because a few minutes before praising her, the guy didn't remember anything good towards the girl. But without thinking for a long time, the young man put his hands behind his head and said that in fact he didn't care. In an instant, to change the topic, he remembered the girl's words about the same symbol, which can be written in different ways. The girl giggled, carefully covering her mouth with her hand because she remembered that strange day. She smiled and said that she did it to make fun of the Demon King. Arriving home, they saw a bespectacled man and some nice couple at the table, sadly telling the guy about the disappearance of their Lisa, in which evil spirits could have been involved. The guy asked if he understood correctly that she ran away after her eyes suddenly lit up with fire. The poor husband and wife looked sadly at each other, meeting their eyes. The woman was able to pretend that Lisa had always been very sweet and obedient, and that what happened was not like her. A little surprised by this description, the bespectacled man decided to ask the couple about whom Lisa was being discussed. The poor woman, sniffling, said that it was their beloved dog, which had been with them for 10 years. Subsequently, the couple left, and the bespectacled man promised them that they would definitely find Lizochka. Lin, who had been listening carefully to the known information all this time, immediately stated that, given the age of the dog, she could safely be called Grandma Lisa. With his hands folded on his chest, the king said haughtily that the girl did not understand anything, because even their boss was called a wealthy boy every time he dined out. These terrible words hurt the bespectacled man to the very heart, forcing him to put his hand on his chest. The guy did not fool around for long and approached the king, saying that he should take the task of setting the search as seriously as possible. The young man snorted with displeasure because he was not at the right level to perform such simple human tasks. Having heard about this, the girl decided to nominate herself for the position of investigator because she loved dogs very much. The bespectacled man returned to her and said that he was not going to bother his own tenants at all. But in the blink of an eye, the scent of competition forced the king to act. So he said a little irritably that he was going to look for the dog lady right now. At that moment, he remembered the words of the young couple about burning eyes. So the guy hoped that he could get some information about the devil. Within a few minutes, the bespectacled man gathered the couple in front of a huge board on which evidence and other information about Lizka were hung. According to witnesses and owners, many dogs in the area showed similar symptoms before running away from home. The king looked at Lin with a smile, mockingly asking the bespectacled man if the dogs ran away from the house just like the one sitting to his right. The young lady looked at the guy offended, calling him a country dog and advising him to stop being so arrogant. The poor bespectacled man no longer knew how to cope with those two who were constantly squabbling with each other, and therefore, in confusion, asked them to listen to him. Based on his guesses and the forum, this phenomenon was called Cerberus and could be a prediction of another visit from the Demon King. Suddenly, Lin invited the guy to compete again, and the guy fiercely agreed, saying that if he wins, the girl will help him for a whole week and stop calling him a dog. Those two were so busy arguing that they didn't even hear the bespectacled man ask them something, so they only turned in his direction in confusion. The poor guy had already lost hope that he would finally be heard, so he simply told them to forget it. The bespectacled boy threw some strange box into the hands of the Demon King, which he barely managed to catch. The guy asked him what was in the wooden box, and the bespectacled man told him about the communication device through which he would communicate with them. A second later, he threw the same box to Mrs. Lin, and she thanked him with a sweet smile. The king carefully opened the box and saw inside a strange bracelet with an index arrow and one earphone with a microphone. Without thinking for long, he simply threw the box away, telling the bespectacled boy that he didn't need such things at all. The guy was seriously outraged by this, and he shouted at the scoundrel to never throw such things around again. The king looked at the young lady with excitement, asking if she was ready, and the girl, with the same sparkle in her eyes, happily agreed with him. They confidently went in different directions, once exchanging cute nicknames and finally leaving the bespectacled man in peace and quiet. The guy walked down the street, with his hands in his pockets, and without haste, thinking about his own plan of action. He decided to use magic, so he called the wind elf to point him in the direction of the magic fluctuations somewhere nearby. Instantly, he felt a feeling that was already familiar to him and smiled contentedly, because it happened faster than he expected. The young man cheerfully walked to where the elf pointed him, already almost feeling the taste of victory. Lin, in turn, got the help of a bespectacled man who told her through an earpiece that a bunch of stray dogs had gathered in one place, which seemed strange to him. It was on the territory of an abandoned badminton club in the old city. And hearing this, the young lady confidently marched there to find some clues. When the girl finally reached the indicated place, she did not find any signs of life there. No matter how Lin tried to look for something, the building really seemed empty to her. Suddenly, in her earphone, she heard the familiar voice of the bespectacled man who said that he had sent her new coordinates, and the arrow on her watch was pointing in their direction. The girl looked at her hand and indeed saw an arrow pointing north. The bespectacled man sat in front of 3 monitors in the shop, pointing it in the right direction. When asked by Lin if he himself created this sign, the guy was a little embarrassed, but conscious of modesty. He added that he had only altered it a little. Returning to a serious look, the guy reminded the girl to be careful, as there might be stray dogs around. The girl joyfully walked around the neighborhood with thoughts that gladdened her heart, because she had finally managed to leave the ill-fated castle. As she walked confidently across the bridge, she was carefully watched by a stranger in a black hood, in whose hands was some strange object wrapped in newspaper. In the end, Lin reached the place where the clock was pointing and carefully opened the door of the building, which opened with a slight creak. The girl entered and shouted to someone to find out if anyone else was there besides her. Instantly, she saw a giant hill in the window and asked the bespectacled man if the dogs could run there. Miss Lin did not wait for his answer and immediately added that she would go and inspect that hill. After she ran out of the building, a bespectacled man responded in the earpiece and agreed with the girl. Lin walked up a long staircase that seemed to go on forever. The girl raised her head up, looking at the sky completely covered with dark rain clouds, and decided that a downpour could soon begin. She heard the voice of the bespectacled man, who said the same thing and advised her to end the search for today. But the girl was stubborn, so she asked him for a little more time. The young lady finally climbed to the top of that hill, proud of what she had accomplished. However, at that same second, a huge lightning flash rang across the sky, and there was thunder between the clouds, after which it began to rain. Not even a minute had passed before a torrential downpour covered the ground, which, it would seem, would not end soon. Trying to somehow escape the rain, the girl covered her head with her hands, and then saw some strange building ahead. Climbing the next staircase, she obeyed the instructions of the bespectacled man, who ordered her to turn left and walk another 50 meters to the nearest pavilion in which she could hide. The rain became more and more intense, but fortunately, the young lady just reached the structure she was supposed to get into. Suddenly, the girl's eyes widened and her face showed great surprise, causing her to scream. The Demon King at that time met a not entirely friendly dog, which he could understand, which the guy was surprised at because he forgot about his ability to understand animals while using magic. Hefty black horns grew on his head again, and the guy ordered the dog with a scar on his left eye to listen to him carefully. The guy solemnly said that he was capable of becoming the world's leading Demon King. Miss Lin saw in front of her a dog lying motionless on the cold concrete, and its left paw was bandaged. The girl happily told May that she had finally found it, without noting what, so the guy was just dying of excitement on the other side of the earpiece. The Demon King carefully examined the beast in front of him, surprised that the so-called Papillonian dog would look like this. The dog, in turn, was seriously surprised that the guy knew the devil himself and, moreover, could use the magic of the Wind Elf. Instantly, he realized that the real Demon King himself was standing in front of him. The dog carefully approached the ruler and guiltily bowed his head at his feet, begging the king to forgive his slave, who did not recognize him. The guy looked at the animal carefully, not understanding which of the slaves the dog was and why he looked like that. The dog stood up and slowly came closer, saying that the story of his existence was incredibly long. But suddenly, he turned around and told the Lord to follow him, because after that the guy himself would understand everything. The street was still crackling as if from a bucket, and besides, it was not clear from where a huge wind had risen. The dog and the Demon King found themselves in front of a building that was very similar to where Lin was. The dog returned to the ruler and reported that they had already arrived at the indicated place. They entered a room with a very strange smell and almost no lighting. The dog, in turn, ordered all his comrades to come out and appear before him. Among the huge piles of various rubbish, street dogs suddenly began to appear, who thought that Kamaris was looking for food. One of the dogs, who looked very much like a husky, approached the leader and asked why he had brought a stranger to them. Hearing that the dog's name was Kamaris, the guy suddenly wondered where he remembered this name from. Kimaris told Amdusias that it was their king who used magic to protect him from the rain. Hearing names familiar to him, the guy suddenly realized who all the dogs were and what happened. Noticing the change in the king's facial expression, Kimaris said that they were all once ghosts of demon warriors who died 3,000 years ago. The Demon King simply froze in surprise, not believing what his subordinate had just told him. But finally understanding, the guy was delighted to meet the ancient warriors. He even shed a little tear because some of them had grown noticeably. Cyprus hopefully asked the young man if he had returned to the world of people to save them. The guy did not immediately understand why his subordinates wanted to return to the devil again, but he said that his original task of coming was the goal of a new invasion, which, unfortunately, failed, and now he too could not return to the kingdom. However, the guy simply could not leave the warriors in the human world, so spreading his hands, he loudly promised that he would take them all home. There was silence in the house of Lisa's owners, in which there were no notes of life or joy. The clock struck 6:30, which was usually dinner time, and the fragrant aromas of food were already wafting from the kitchen. A bunch of different dishes were already visible on the table, and the husband was just calling his wife to the table. The woman sat alone on an armchair and peered out of the window with an empty gaze, thinking about poor Lisa and whether she had hidden from the rain. The husband tried to cheer her up, assuring her that everything was fine with Liska and they would definitely find her. The couple's children had long been adults and therefore rarely visited them, and Lisa became a full-fledged member of the family in 10 years, so the woman refused to eat anything. The woman at least somehow wanted to help the poor dog, which is why she suggested that her husband leave and look for her a little more. He understood that there would be no point in these searches, so he advised leaving this matter to professionals. Lynn carefully stroked the dog's head, which didn't look quite well, but at the same time someone bandaged its wound and left some food and water. The exhausted animal, with tears in its eyes, looked up at the young lady and quietly addressed her. Completely not expecting this, the poor thing even recoiled, at first not understanding whether she really heard the words from the dog's side, and May, on the other side, tried to ask Lynn about what he had also heard. Lisa herself was surprised that she was understood, even more than the girl, and therefore she ordered the young lady not to tell anyone about this. After that, Miss Lynn began to make excuses to the bespectacled man, which he, like her, simply heard. The young lady smelled of the Demon King's scent, which was the reason why Lynn understood her, which meant that the ruler had indeed returned to the human world. The puzzled Lynn, dumbfounded, only repeated his name, and the bespectacled man on the other side was simply tearing up his earpiece with questions. Hearing the sounds coming from the earphone, Lisa instantly barked for the young lady to immediately turn off the earphone. Lynn immediately began to pretend that the connection had suddenly failed in order to get rid of the bespectacled man on the other side. The guy tried to do something, but the girl hissed something several times and turned off the earphone. After that, the young lady warmly approached Liska, saying that she had never before seen a dog that could talk. Liska thought that since the girl knew the king, she could tell her the truth. So the dog said that her real name was Zagan. A little embarrassed, Lynn said that she didn't know any demon kings except for one guy who called himself that. But despite this, he wasn't bad. Suddenly, Zagan declared that after 3,000 years in the human world, her life was on the brink. Lynn looked at the animal in confusion, ordering her to stop saying nonsense, but Zagan was not joking. She asked the girl to help her return home so that she could die next to her owners. Lan tried to convince Zagan not to say that because her owners would be very upset. Lowering her head, Zagan said that her body was already almost exhausted and she no longer had the magic to find a new one. Suddenly, the girl realized that all those stories about the Demon King and magic were not fiction at all. Zagan stared into the pouring rain, still lashing outside the window, and sadly spoke about the desire of all her comrades to be buried in their home. But she would really like to face death in the human world, since she once made her choice. Lynn affectionately stroked Liska's head, concluding that the poor thing was completely lonely. Suddenly, strange sounds were heard outside, very similar to someone's steps or rustling. A boy appeared at the door, calling for a little flower because he had brought her anti-inflammatory and some food. Having gathered all the ghost warriors, the Demon King solemnly began his speech. One of the dogs told him that they had always strived and wanted to return to the kingdom of demons. Amdusias added that he recently noticed changes in the boundary between the human and demonic worlds, so he guessed that one of the demons had entered the human world. Cyprus confirmed the words of his comrade, saying that after these guesses he gathered all the other dogs in one place. He hoped that this way their magical power could become strong enough to open a portal. Amdishuas was worried that their magical powers were about to end, and if they did not return home, death would catch up with them right in the human world. But fortunately, the king happened to be in the human world at that time, so they all suddenly had the opportunity to make their own dreams come true. The warriors were happy that the Demon King had finally appeared to them, but they still did not fully believe that this was really happening. The guy himself breathed a sigh of relief, considering this meeting his greatest gift, and therefore he decided to erect a monument to all the soldiers upon returning home for their devotion and courage. Mistress Lisa instantly had a good feeling. It seemed to her that the dog was about to return, and besides, the weather outside had also improved. The husband gently hugged his wife by the shoulder, agreeing with her, because he also sincerely believed in her return. The owner stood up and addressed all his subjects, declaring that they would all definitely return to their own kingdom. After his words, dead silence reigned in the room, and the guy already doubted his words, not understanding why the dogs were looking at him so strangely. Cypress was the first to respond, saying that they were completely ready and the king could open the gates at any time. Carefully choosing his words, the guy said that his magic was not enough for such a strong spell, and therefore he would need their help. All subjects unanimously proposed to set up a meeting so that tomorrow at noon they could return to the kingdom together, to which the young man agreed. Realizing that the slaves reacted calmly, the king then added that he still had one unfinished business before. He took Cypress in his arms and began to joyfully say that he just had to go to the girl and prove to her his victory. The guy thought that the dog was born as a female dog and was a so-called papillon dog, but he needed to check it out. But after a split second, the poor thing screamed and waved his arms, realizing that he was holding a male in front of his nose. Lowering his head in embarrassment, Cypress said that the guy probably meant Zagan, who abandoned herself in the honor of the demons, after which she was expelled. The boy carefully bandaged the Zagan's paw, pleasantly surprised that the bandage did not get wet in such heavy rain. How skillfully the kid coped with saving the animal was carefully observed by Lin, who was surprised at his every movement. He didn't really like her interest, so he said that he was an assistant at the veterinary clinic so that she wouldn't look down on him. While getting food for the cats, the guy said that he went there after school and almost gave up halfway because of the rain. Noticing the baby's admiration, Lin asked him if he really loved dogs as much as she did, to which he agreed and added that it was his favorite animal. He decided to ask the young lady if she had a dog at home, because she also really liked these cute animals. The girl said that her family had Dobermans, Labradors, and even Dalmatians, but her parents never allowed her to touch the dogs. The guy said that it was really sad, which Lin couldn't help but agree with, but in the end, it was one of the reasons for her running away. Hanging his nose, the guy said sadly that he would probably only be able to get a dog when he lived on his own. The baby's story was very similar to the young lady's story, so she began to support him and assure him that someday everything would definitely be fine. On such a wonderful note, even the weather improved, which made Lin and the baby's mood noticeably improve. Behind them, Zagan responded, it was time for her to return home and she needed help with this. Lin happily agreed to take Lizka home, assuring her that everything would definitely be fine. Finally, after an hour of silence, the young lady turned on the earphone to hear the bespectacled man again. The girl pretended that the device had started working again and asked May to send her the coordinates of the couple's house where Lizka lived. The guy immediately agreed, and within a second the young lady was following the sign and trying to figure out the route. But this time something strange really started to happen to the device. All the bespectacled man had time to say was that the battery was dead, after which the earphone turned off. The surprised boy behind did not understand who the girl was talking to, so he decided to ask about it. Not intending to answer, the young lady only sweetly put her index finger to her lips, making it clear that this was a secret. Lin was holding Lizka in her arms, and a boy was walking next to her, and in this formation they confidently walked towards the dog's owners. Walking along the road, the kid said that he found Joggin that morning on the hill, and because he helped her, then the kid served his sentence. The puzzled young lady looked at the boy in surprise, not understanding what kind of punishment he was talking about. The girl did not understand why the baby had to pay for doing such a good deed. The guy grinned and said that he was not going to complain, because for the sake of this, he was ready to serve his sentence for hours. When the friends approached the trash can, the kid asked them to wait for him, because he had one important thing to do. The boy carefully took the bag with the waste left behind by Lizka and threw it away. A little later, he even became sad because he did not want to say goodbye to Lizka. Miss Lin stood there and didn't even know how she could support him because she, like him, would have to say thirst, Papa. But overcoming the feeling of sadness, The young man stubbornly ordered to go in order to return the dog home as quickly as possible. Lin happily agreed with him, preparing for the responsible journey. It was already quite dark outside, but the friends had just reached the house of Lizka's owners and rang the doorbell. A question was asked outside the door about who had come, and a moment later a man appeared in front of the friends. Following his voice was the voice of his wife, who asked about any news about Lizka. But coming closer to the door, the woman saw the beauty in the man's arms and joyfully rushed to her. Cyprus had just finished telling the story of Jagan, who renounced the greatness of the king, to which he only added that her contribution to the kingdom was almost the greatest in history. Cyprus, in turn, said that throughout all 3,000 years, ghosts cooperated only with street dogs. An exchange once took place between them, during which the dogs gave their bodies to the ghosts, and the warriors, in turn, made them happy. 10 years ago, Jagan chose the life of a domestic dog, giving up her honor and willingly joining the human world. Although the Demon King did not show it, he understood the poor thing inside, because his current life was also connected with people. This was the reason why the young man stood up for Zagan, trying to explain that with her pride she could not make such a decision so easily. Cyprus bowed his head and said that at first he thought it was a thoughtless mistake, but over time he realized that Jagan had indeed betrayed them. Last night all the stray dogs gathered around her and, calling her a traitor, bit the poor thing in anger, after which she ran away. But now Cyprus and the others felt ashamed of their actions. She was once their friend and comrade. The king even smiled affectionately, thinking that Jagan was indeed a real girl. But finally, the puzzle in his head was completed. Not expecting such an answer, Cyprus asked the bishop in surprise whether he would look for Zagan after all that had been done. After thinking a little, the guy replied that her pride would bring the dog to them at noon, so it was useless to look for the animal. Lizka's owners stood there and couldn't be happier that she had been found, while Lin and the boy watched them with joy. The young lady was very glad that they were able to give the couple such a wonderful family memory. The boy agreed with her and added that he really wanted Little Flower to feel happy. While the woman went to soak up Lizka, the man invited his friends to go inside. But unfortunately, the baby had to run home, because at such a late time he should have been home a long time ago. Lin thought that she didn't want to be there alone either, so she asked the owners to let her take another look at the puppy. The kid happily waved to the owners and added that he would definitely return to visit the flower. The surprised man stared at Lin, not understanding which flower he was talking about. The young lady explained to him with a smile that this was the nickname the kid chose when he didn't know Lizka's name. Lin walked up to Jagan and carefully sat down, and she, in turn, sincerely thanked her for her help. The girl affectionately said that even without knowing anything about Lizka's life, she simply could not stay away. Having stroked the baby behind the ear, Miss Lin added that, nevertheless, she saw how much Lizka loved her owners. Not noticing how quickly time flew by, Lin did not even notice how the clock struck 8 and she already had to run home. When the young lady had already turned to leave, Jagan excitedly asked her for one more favor. Madame Lin turned around with curiosity in her eyes and was ready to listen and help. Jagan asked her new friend to take her to a place tomorrow morning as it was very important to her. She added that she would really like to see her friends from the demon world, so she will wait for Lin in the courtyard tomorrow. Lin smiled sweetly and agreed, because looking into Lizka's eyes, she simply could not say no to the beauty. The girl walked alone along an empty street, turning over the events of that difficult day in her head. She wondered whether the village dog, who apparently lost to the couple, had time to return home. But suddenly realizing that she was thinking about this guy again, the girl immediately discarded these thoughts, pretending that she didn't care about him at all. Opening the door of the shop, the young lady dreamed only of a hot shower and clean, soft clothes. Before Lin even had time to go home, an excited, bespectacled man immediately jumped out in front of her. He said that he was worried that the girl would not return again and then asked if she had solved the problem. Lin asked the guy if the Demon King had already returned. The bespectacled guy leaned his elbows on the table and said that even the white guy had no idea where that guy was hanging around. The bespectacled man sincerely thanked Lin for her help because she volunteered for the adventure without even working in the shop. The girl smiled happily and said that she incredibly loved helping others, so there was no need for gratitude. The day really turned out to be exhausting, so the young lady decided to go to the shower and relax a little, and the bespectacled man only guiltily apologized for the communication device after her. The young lady said that it was just a stupid joke, and the device itself worked flawlessly, so the guy had nothing to worry about. The bespectacled boy remained in the position he had been in for the next 30 seconds, trying to process what Lin called a joke. The morning of the next day turned out to be warm and sunny, so the ghosts of the warriors were already beginning to prepare for the ritual. Cyprus stated that it was about time, because time passed and their bodies became weaker. Amdusias walking nearby reminded him that the majestic Demon King was still sleeping, so the dogs unanimously decided to begin preparations. One of the dogs carefully approached the bishop and sniffed him to make sure that he was still snoring sweetly. The king slept so sweetly that he even talked in his sleep, sucking the finger on his left hand. Meanwhile, in the shop, Miss Lin slept soundly, gaining strength from yesterday. Instantly, the young lady exploded, realizing that it was already too bright for the morning outside. Not understanding what was wrong, the poor thing sat down on the bed trying to come to her senses. Finally, she looked at the alarm clock and realized that she had overslept for several hours. The girl quickly got dressed and left the room, because the fear of being late and that Zagan would not see his friends completely wrapped her heart. Lin flew in awe near the bathtub, where May was brushing his teeth, and told the guy that she would borrow his bike. The guy was so sleepy that he didn't even realize what had just happened. The guy turned towards the door. He wasn't even sure that someone had passed there. Not finding anyone, he returned to his morning routine, thinking about the girl he was supposed to meet at lunch today. Not even a few decades had passed before the Demon King finally decided to get up with the thoughts that today was his only weekly day off, which meant it was time to investigate. Surprised Cyprus stared at the guy, not understanding what he was talking about, because everyone was waiting for his order. Suddenly, all the dogs in the room bowed their heads in front of him, unanimously saying that they were waiting for them to return to the kingdom. Without thinking, the guy blurted out that it was simply impossible to return to the kingdom. But by falling silent in time, he remembered everything that happened yesterday and thereby saved his life. Quickly changing his tone and intonation, the young man confidently said that today everyone was expected to return home. All the dogs became an amazing magic circle, which Amdusias researched and created for 3,000 years. Cyprus smiled contentedly, glad that they could finally use this circle. The Demon King looked at the creation of one of his subjects, thinking that this was indeed a great contribution. Cyprus confidently walked inside, adding that he would begin the ritual, but if things did not go according to plan, he would need the help of the Lord. The guy ordered him to wait, because even though the clock had almost struck south, Zagan had not yet appeared. Lin rode her bike as fast as she could, worried about making it in time. The girl pulled up to the house of an elderly couple and slammed on the brakes, screeching to a stop. A woman was sitting in the courtyard of the house, and Zagan was sleeping peacefully next to her, waiting for Lin. As soon as she saw the young lady, she immediately rushed towards her, joyfully barking and jumping up. Lin carefully took it in her hands, asking the woman to lend her a small flower for a while. The hostess asked in surprise who Little Flower was, but Lin, almost starting to move, just shouted that it was the nickname that the boy gave to the league. The young lady put the dog in the basket in front and pressing the pedals, she flew away as quickly as she could. Lin was glad that she had time and everything worked out for them, after which the girl asked Lizka to show her the way, to which the dog happily agreed and thanked her. The girls finally arrived, and Lin grabbed Zagan and quickly ran, asking her if her friends were close. Zagan's eyes lit up, and she said that her friends were in an abandoned house because the fluctuations in magic were the greatest. While the girl was rushing towards that building, Lizka asked her if she was really selfish for leaving all her friends and cheating on them. The young lady looked sympathetically at the dog, saying that she was in no way selfish. Zagan did this out of a feeling of love. Lizka sighed guiltily, asking if we were talking about that very human love that everyone so strives for. She told Lin how 3,000 years ago you made people suffer by burning the entire human world. After the war ended, she mistakenly chose the dog's body and eventually decided to run away, only to be found by her current owner. As soon as the man took the poor puppy in his arms, she immediately felt a warmth of embrace that she had never felt before. Realizing that this feeling had become incredibly valuable to her, Zagan decided to stay in peace and never harm people again. But despite her good intentions, like all living beings, her life was coming to an end. Lin looked at the animal sympathetically, not knowing how else she could help her. Zagan quickly raised her head and looked the young lady in the eyes, asking if this was a real feeling of love. Tears welled up in Miss Lin's eyes, and she said that without a doubt it was that incredible love. The girl looked at Lizka and confidently said that this was even more than the love of some people. The Demon King, along with his other subjects, had already begun to doubt a little that Zagan would come. As much as the guy didn't want to accept it, the dog really didn't seem to want to come, so he turned to Kamaris. After thinking a little, the guy confidently said that it was time for them to start, with Zagan or without her. The subjects obediently entered the circle and the eccentric drawing shone and began to make noise. The earth moved and the room began to fill with a bunch of blue lights, which became larger with each word of the spell. Cyprus smiled contentedly, saying that their magic circle was working and they should never have stopped. Huge horns appeared on the Demon King's head, which were several times larger than those that usually appeared. The guy put out his hand and began to cast a spell, calling on the elves of darkness to destroy the barrier. A sphere began to form around everyone who was in the magic circle, which grew larger and brighter every second. Cyprus shouted loudly that the Demon King himself was with them to help his subjects return home, so everyone had to continue. A huge portal began to appear in front of them, around which everything was shining with a bright blue flame and making noise. Cyprus looked at the gate to the world of demons, thinking that they had finally succeeded. But the guy's face showed sadness, even though the way home was so close. After wandering around the human world for so long, he could finally return to his own kingdom, but something inside him stopped him. Cyprus returned to the ruler and stated that all his subjects would like to go through the portal after him, but the guy only waved away such a proposal, and his horns slowly disappeared. The young man spread his hands joyfully and said that after 3,000 years that they spent in the human world for the sake of the demon world, the subjects deserved to return home first. Lin quickly stopped at an abandoned building, from the windows of which an incredibly bright glow could be seen. The girl seemed petrified by what she saw. The magical light enchanted her, depriving her of her tongue. Liska asked the young lady to put her down, because she wanted to go on alone, without strangers. The still stunned girl crouched down and carefully placed the dog on the floor, without taking her eyes off the radiance. Jagan said that she would return very soon, and Lin agreed to wait for her in the same place. A whole line of slaves lined up at the portal to the world of demons, watched from the side by the Demon King with Cyprus. Cyprus asked the Lord if anything had changed in the world of demons, as well as in the world of people since the war. The guy replied that in hell little could have changed in such a time, because time passed faster there. But he was sure that everyone there was joyfully waiting for the ghost warriors, even after 3,000 years. Cyprus said that he was also eager to meet everyone, but unfortunately his magic could no longer support his body for a long time. Before going through the portal, Amdusias told the king that he would be glad to wait to meet him on the other side. All the warriors successfully managed to enter the portal, except for Cyprus, who stood and watched the spectacle that he had been waiting for so long. The king, noticing this, reminded the faithful servant that everyone inside was waiting for him. Finally daring, he came closer, about to step home, when he suddenly heard his own name. Both he and the guy turned in surprise at the voice. Very similar to Zagan, the Demon King actually saw poor Zagan at the door, who bowed her head guiltily and slowly walked into the room. Feeling guilty, she asked Cyprus for forgiveness for not having time to say goodbye to all her friends. But he was not at all happy about her forgiveness, Cyprus returned, stood at the bar and angrily growled that traitors were not welcome there.